We're delighted to welcome you all to the Great BAME debate. My name is Palumi Ojo and I'm an Executive Support Manager at Aon, and I also co-chair our Multicultural Network. And joining me this evening is Siva Karthikeyan, Head of Financial Governance and also co-chair of our Multicultural Network. Tonight's event is in partnership with ICAN and YDWC. We're here to debate a much used term, BAME, an acronym that describes Black, Asian and minority ethnic people. The use of the term BAME has grown in prominence in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic and the Black Lives Matter protests. We have also seen language have a huge impact on the willingness and reluctance of people to talk about race. Is the term BAME fit for purpose? Are there any suitable alternatives? Does language matter? Does BAME help to progress through diversity and inclusion?
Words carry meaning and power, and the way in which we can refer to an individual or groups of people can be an evidence of respect, or it can convey disregard. This can make someone feel powerful and valued, or it can reinforce dominant norms. So with the term BAME used more widely, as Palumi alluded, it is important that we make a conscious effort to reflect on the way we communicate and equip ourselves with a vocabulary that will ultimately help change attitudes and also drive positive action that I'm sure we all want to see.
BAME, or grouping minorities together, is basically a term that was imposed on us. It's a term that allows white people to understand the concept of other. It is a term that makes it palatable for us as to group people together that are non-white. But let me tell you why this is harmful. All it does is reinforce power structures at hand. It reinforces this idea that if you're not white, you're a homogenous block, that we all have the same problems, the same issues, the same community, and the same culture, which obviously is not true. And you guys as opposition, and what everyone on this call will hear is the opposition will say, oh, but it will help once one person gets on the line, then we can all get on the line and blah, blah, blah. But really, what can I say to you? Has that ever really worked? Is that actually a good example of an issue that's worked?
Now, it's important to stress that using the term BAME is not incompatible with understanding that the Black experience is different to that of, say, the white experience or, say, the Asian experience. And in fact, while I've mentioned this term Asian, let's spend a moment appreciating that even the term Asian can have huge complexity. In the UK, the Asian experience can differ widely depending on whether you're Bangladeshi, Pakistani, Indian, and that's just the narrow UK interpretation of Asian. My heritage is Chinese Malaysian, and people sometimes forget that this is Asian too. I have no issue with the term Asian, even with how wide this term is. Just as I am Chinese, Malaysian, British, European and Asian all at the same time and within different contexts, so am I proud to identify as part of the BAME community. There's a way of thinking here that's complex and plural, and I'm inviting you to apply that same nuance to this debate. You can choose to have an instant hate of the term BAME, or you can look beyond it to the intentions and complexities. And I think we're all capable of moving beyond a binary cancel culture type of thinking around the term BAME. When recruitment companies specialise in BAME recruitment, or when reports show that BAME students get worse marks at school and university, or more harrowing still, when studies show that patients from a BAME background suffer worse outcomes from COVID-19, we can choose to take umbrage at the term BAME, or we can choose to see the real message, that there's a commonality of experience that we share. Research shows that for 70% of BAME employees, career progression is important compared to only 42% of white British employees. Over half of BAME employees, 52%, believe they'll have to leave their current organisation to progress their career, and that contrasts with 38% of white British employees. As you can see, BAME is a great tool to highlight the differences between the experiences of majorities and that of a collective minority.
Just on that point.
Go ahead, Becky.
But if recent data is showing that 26% of Caribbean kids get strong passes at GCSEs, and 44% of African ones do, then by using the term BAME, are we not clubbing together things that become quite unhelpful when put together to not actually see the problem?
There's no contradiction.
Why is it important to have a detailed understanding of ethnicity rather than grouping them all as BAME? Let me ask you a question. If you put £10,000 of your own personal money into a company and you wanted to know that that company is doing the best it can to grow, not least in the increasing complex and challenging market that we're currently in. Now, if you try and understand that the FTSE 100, they've got 75% of their revenues coming and generating from outside of the UK, and most of that is coming from Africa and Asian economies, then you would hope that there's somebody at least sitting in that boardroom that understands the cultural nuances that are specific to the markets that you're trying to operate in. There's no point hiring 10 Indians to get your BAME quota up, and the right approach actually trying to get into the Shanghai market. It's not really going to be very useful. Furthermore, diversity of thought is not of white and non-white. True diversity benefits from cultural and experiential, i.e. a lived experience of the uniqueness of each ethnicity. Every market you operate in, or indeed the market one day you hope to operate in. And masking ethnicity of the people in your organization like an umbrella term will not enable you or your shareholders to understand the strength of your team. Now, in a world where we are trying to break down data as much as possible, so much so that we even say data is more valuable than oil, then I'm afraid in your organization you have a significant oil leak, which you have to really consider now. This is not an argument that falls on the narrow shoulders of social justice as we've seen so far this year, but also one that falls on the broader shoulders of good economics. Shareholder confidence that you have an organization geared up to face the world's challenges, not just in a market far away, but in a market close to home, knowing that over 30% of London is now very ethnic. Now, language is used to normalize irrational thought. There's 6 billion people in Asia and Africa. Just try and digest that. 6 billion people out of a total of 7.7 billion. And by grouping everyone together as non-white, some homogenous group that must share similar characteristics, by adding them to our organization is not only ineffective, but I would go as far as saying it's irresponsible. In conclusion, the term BAME was set up with the intention of unity. What it's turned into, unfortunately, is uniformity. And to do the bare minimum to tick that box, when you do the bare minimum, you're going to get the bare minimum out. Sorry, I'll take your point.
So what term would you use instead?
Well, I wouldn't use a term, and that's the point. You'd want to understand, well, what is the basis of what your organization is made up of? What are the different ethnicities that make up? And if you're going to enter into the Ethiopian market, there's no point having 6 Chinese people and 2 Indians because you've met a BAME quota that's something that you think is representative. You want to understand at the most minor level. You walk into any organization today and you see the importance of data and understanding how to use data. Why are we hiding it with BAME?
The transformative power of collective action is a fact. So rarely is historic change a result of individual action. Take as an example trade unions. We have them to amplify collective voices. How many of you remember the Unison TV advert with the bear? Very quickly, a colony of ants wants the bear to move out the way. One calls out, "Excuse me," but isn't heard. Ditto the second and the third. Then a whole colony rushes forward and shouts, "Excuse me," and the startled bear jumps out of the way. The punchline being, if you want to be heard, speak in unison. So how does that translate to the issue at hand? Are we better off united under this acronym, or splintering off with each group doing its own thing?
So your argument creates this framework that it's like white people and non-white people, and that's really what we're fighting against. And again, I would say that lacks nuance. The issues within us, even as individuals, as groups, as communities, we have different issues. And to kind of frame it in this framework that, oh, if one person helps, then we can all help, then it's not really the issue. We can be allies. and issues within other communities, we can support them. That doesn't necessarily mean that the issues within our own communities. And that's why nuance is really important within this, for us to basically not frame it as it's them and us, and BAME together as some collective, oppression.
So with respect, I think because I didn't actually finish my argument, you've rather missed the point, which is that I'm referring to the commonality of our experience as a unifying factor. We do have some common experiences. And I'm saying that if you look away from the superficial and just saying it's either white or non-white, and look at how we can help each other, there are grounds in which. So I'm going to go back to my stats. If you look at the stats, 2011 census, there were 55 million people in the UK. Of those, 87% identified as white, and a surprising 13% were identified essentially as minority ethnic. So I think we can agree 13% is a statistically significant percentage. But if you break that down and just look at individual numbers, they become quite small. So Asian or Asian British Chinese, 0.7% of the population, Black or Black British, 3%, and so on. So if these groups were to rely solely on their own individual economic or social impact, it would be relatively minor. Whereas if you think about how the collective clout that group could have, I think there is a potential for real change. Take the example further, quickly, and look at what we do. Look at the city. I think most of the people here work in city jobs. Most of us, I think you'll agree, if we are minorities, know other minorities within our firm. Why? Because the startling reality is that there are very few. And if we try and speak up as individuals, whether we single ourselves out as Caribbean or African or whatever, it does not have the impact of us coming together. What I'm saying is that in tackling inequality and dealing with these initiatives, we need strength in numbers. And whilst admittedly not without grounds for criticism, so I'm not saying it's perfect, the BAME acronym does that by unifying us under a single, easily understood phrase.
In of itself, the term BAME represents some kind of shared commonality that does occur between all of these individual groups. And I know somebody from the floor made the point, what is the issue, our commonality, or is it our uniqueness? When we say it's not that simple, that actually both of these things are very important. And then as to the question of what is it anti-black? Is it the sense that black people get lost in it? Well, we say two things. The first is the term itself places black people right at the beginning of it. But even more important than that, we say that actually, black people are clearly a central part of this particular group. And actually there continue to be initiatives and continue to be support that center out where that particular group itself it does not necessarily get the support that it needs. And the question is, well, is it actually harmful to the progression of true diversity and inclusion? Well, we say if there isn't true diversity and inclusion, the issue here isn't necessarily the term BAME, but it's the laziness of those individuals who use that term, or who are meant to when finding or trying to hit targets within their own organisation, doing that ineffectively, and don't actually take account of the individuality that can still exist while relating to that particular term. What's become clear, and this point was clearly made on the floor, is that for the purpose of, we clearly need something to describe the group that isn't the majority. And the term we seem to have opted for is BAME. And we say, well, look, if you look at COVID numbers, if you look at school results, there's clearly some common experience that's happened that's relevant to everybody who's not white. And that's relevant to determining what's going on within this particular group. And so not only is it useful just say from a data and statistical purpose, and that's something that Pramit really didn't really discuss or address when making his points about what occurs in business. But we say it's relevant because it brings all of us together in a way that gives us increased power, and that's black people and minority ethnic people. When you break these groups down individually, they just don't have anywhere near the level and amount of power that they'd like, that they wish they had. And that collective bargaining from a bunch of people from different places that have different cultural references, but do have some kind of shared experience, actually ends up being better for diversity and inclusion for these groups as a whole than it does for being worse. And we also think it's useful just from a unifying aspect, just from the idea that when these people often find themselves in professional environments by themselves, and can actually and are made to think about other minorities in a way that shows some kind of kindness, that makes them that gives them something within the workplace that we say really here is to be celebrated. And we say, well, look, and the proposition will say to us, well, nobody uses this term for themselves. Nobody would ever describe themselves as them. And we say, well, that's not really the point. That actually, there are plenty of people that clearly recognize themselves as a minority. And this particular term serves to further advance their particular agenda.
We on the proposition say, you know, any minority should be able to feel represented in a term which is supposed to be for collective action for minority peoples. We end up with one of two situations. One is that BAME is some semi-specialist term for people who are Black, people who are Asian, depending how you understand Asian, we don't know what the A is, and general minorities. And it's not quite clear why, as Joel himself said, Black is first. If I was from somewhere else, I wouldn't really understand that, but fine. But so we were told it's nuanced and not binary, but that point really seems to go into the second, which is, because if it's nuanced, we need to see what that nuance is actually sort of helpful for. And then that went into, well, it's helpful in some places. And the places we were told it was helpful was in things like education and COVID. Well, as per my point of information, actually in education, we see that it really distracts from issues. We see that Bangladeshi children often do terribly badly. We see that Caribbean kids, and particularly Caribbean boys, underperform African girls to a huge degree. So we are obscuring facts. COVID is another situation where we on the proposition are saying there's been a huge obscuring of the issues. Chinese people less likely to die than white people. Well, using the term BAME in no way helps us there. And then we have this point about the power of collective action. Well, I think it's interesting that, you know, historically in the 70s when the term BAME was started, we had about 2% Black people in the census. That's not the position now. 14 is a lot more than that. And if we want collective action, we on the proposition are explaining that collective action needs to be collective action of all minority people. Actually, what we've shown you on the proposition side is that this is exactly the right time to stamp out the use of the term BAME, because there's a serious issue. We know that for shareholder value, we know that for the sake of actually being able to do things that are important, we need to do better, and we need to do better for people who would identify as Black, Caribbean, for Indian, Chinese. There needs to be a better solution than the one we have. And we on the proposition, on that basis, say no to BAME. It's not helping, it's actively hindering.
No one likes labels, and you know, this is something that's exploded pretty much this year. You know, this discomfort around the use of the term BAME, but it has actually been around for a long time. And I hope, regardless of what side you are on, you took some takeaways today around how complicated and complex this matter is. You know, language matters. You heard it from both sides. You know, is it helpful? Is it unhelpful? Are we being pedantic? Is it a distraction? You know, or is it simply in 2020 just completely, you know, ridiculous to be grouping people in these terms? In an attempt to be inclusive, we probably have become exclusive and have created a divide.